Hi Sam, good morning,
Morning, Asa.
and hello to all the listeners, all the many listeners that we are accumulating on our podcast. Welcome. Today's topic is well, we're going to be talking about a commonly used term, which is known as toxic masculinity. So we're going to be unpacking that term today and looking at that in a lot of detail. Before we do that, Sam, just want to check in with you, see how you are today.
Um, I'm I've actually got a stinking cold, Asa. So I apologise to you and our listeners if I'm coughing and spluttering. Um, but I do feel better getting up and kind of having a shower and getting ready and doing this rather than sort of lying in bed and um feeling consumed by it. So it has helped getting up, but I'm not on top form, I must be honest with you.
Okay, well, Sam, thanks for sharing that and being so transparent. I know that it's kind of very normal for people to kind of say I'm fine
Mhm.
and brush those kind of things under the carpet as if they're not really happening. But it's nice to see that you feel you're able to kind of share your emotions and feelings, which is what we're all about. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's important, absolutely important. And how are you?
Yeah, and just to say, I empathize with your low illness, and I'm sorry to hear that, Sam.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm okay, thanks. I had a little bit of a later night than usual last night, so I'm slightly lower on energy. But as you can see, we're both very committed to the cause of sharing the message of positive men's mental health. There is a very good reason for my slightly later than usual night last night, which is a part of the podcast. So I will bring that in shortly. But before we do that, shall I break down the topic that we're going to be talking about and explain exactly what we're going to do in reference to that?
yes, please. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, awesome. So, first of all, if we look at what is actually meant by the term toxic masculinity, so
Mhm.
how it's defined and how it can be kind of unpacked a little bit, because I know that there's counter arguments either side. Some people would say the term in itself is actually quite divisive
Mhm.
unhelpful,
Mhm.
whereas other people kind of use it quite freely. So we need to look at what is actually meant by toxic masculinity.
Yep.
Then we're going to move into the counter arguments for, like I say, people that don't think there's such a thing as toxic masculinity. A lot of people don't actually think it exists and think that the term should be, should not be used.
Correct. Yeah.
So we'll look at that. I think it would be really helpful for the listeners if we break down a couple of examples of what we're really talking about here when we talk about toxic masculinity, whether it be kind of well-known examples or some of our own personal experiences.
Absolutely.
And then from there we can look at where it originates, where toxic masculinity might originate from, how it comes to be in our society, in our communities,
Mhm.
in the individuals that kind of carry those traits. And then we're going to finish up by looking at why we think these things are important, why they matter,
Yeah.
and what people can do if they feel that maybe a son, maybe a friend, maybe a partner, maybe a colleague, or even a parent has or is carrying these kind of negative traits of masculinity and might benefit from working through those. How does that sound to you, Sam?
Absolutely. Sounds great, Asa. And just a slight little add-on as well. If you, I don't know if you, sorry if you said this already and I missed it, but if you feel like you're identifying things like this in yourself as well, you said about your son or your
Oh,
partner and all that. So I'm sorry if I missed you say that, but that's for any listeners that feel like they might be experiencing kind of these sort of traits for themselves. You're welcome to get in contact with either myself or Asa through our, the links on our YouTube to our websites, or any sort of, any therapist in your local area.
Uh, Absolutely, yeah, really good point, and thanks for adding that, Sam. I do appreciate it. So Sam, I wonder if you might want to kick us off by telling us or telling the listeners, telling me, because yeah, what does toxic masculinity mean to you?
Mhm.
How do you define that term?
Yeah, so I suppose um, I think I have been toxically masculine before, um,
Hmm.
and I think it's sort of growing up. I think it was sort of probably kind of accepted around people that I was around. So I think it was maybe part of fitting in, I guess. Uh,
Hmm.
and maybe it was about um, viewing women in a certain way, which I'm not proud of. Um, and I think certainly the element which is sort of defined, if you look up definitions on the internet, toxic masculinity, there's lots of kind of definitions around not showing feelings, showing feelings as weakness and all that sort of stuff. And that I certainly was a victim of that myself. And I would sort of repress certain feelings and push them down, which was very, very unhelpful. It was something I'd always done. So it just felt sort of, it felt natural, I guess, but it wasn't healthy. Um, so I would sort of push down feelings that I didn't feel were okay for me to show, and then they would
Hmm.
come out like in massive bursts of anger, or I'd get ill. Like I'd be pushing stress down because it's not all right to be stressed. I've got to stay strong. I've got to be all right. And then it would come out and like I'd have the flu, or I'd have
Hmm.
I've got today. I haven't been repressing stress. I have just got a cold. But it's yeah. So I think I can identify, before I was aware of, before I was more self-aware, I think before I knew more about myself, I think I was certainly I certainly had some of these traits.
Sure, sure. And thanks so much for sharing that, Sam. Really interesting to hear that you talk about the physical response to suppressing emotions and feelings. I think that's something that's quite often overlooked. But I think you're absolutely right. If we do suppress our emotions and our feelings, or if it comes out, as aggression and anger and things like that, then there absolutely is a physical response to that. Ultimately, these feelings and emotions that people or yourself are trying to kind of oppress.
Mm,
Ultimately, your brain can't ignore those feelings and emotions, so your brain does have a response to them, even if you're not demonstrating that response in your actions and behavior.
hmm
So your brain will release chemicals, as I'm sure you know, that respond to the feeling that you have. So, for example, if you have stress, if you have, if you're burnt out, if you're under pressure, then
mm,
all the time your brain will be releasing these chemicals, and as a result, those chemicals are going to have an impact on your physical state and your immune system and so on. So another really good reason why it's so important to talk about your emotions and feelings and be open and transparent about those. So thanks for those for that.
yeah.
A couple of things that you didn't mention there, but I'll just touch on. So typically, I think when people talk about traits of toxic masculinity, yes, emotional suppression, like you mentioned about kind of your perception of women. So, typically that kind of comes under the heading of like misogyny,
hmm
homophobia.
hmm
You mentioned a little bit about anger. So, aggression and dominance are traits of kind of toxic masculinity. Um, Coming back to the part about women's sexual conquests and things like that,
Yeah.
and kind of boasting about those kind of things, or like the notches on the bedpost kind of concept is a trait of toxic masculinity, or how people might define toxic masculinity. And then the final one would just be kind of self-reliance. So where people kind of, or men in particular, don't reach out for help, don't have a support network, don't feel like they need any help from anyone else. They think they can deal with all their problems themselves, and kind of be a bit of an island and so on, isolate themselves.
Mm.
And the reality is there are negative consequences of doing that. So that's my understanding of it. Does that match with basically what you were saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that we've spoken about kind of support network and stuff before in our previous podcast. Obviously the importance of support network, but also kind of barriers. And I think this what we're talking about today can certainly would fall into a barrier, wouldn't it? To having a kind of healthy support network, I guess. I think if you're surrounded, if you surrounded yourself with people that have similar kind of ideas and views and things like that, and
Mm.
if you feel like you're toxically masculine, or that's you've got some traits, you've got other people that have traits like that, it's unlikely that they're all gonna everyone's going to share their feelings in that group, isn't it? So you're probably
Yeah.
all going to be kind of individually isolated, which is uh, difficult. Yeah. Sorry,
Absolutely.
a bit of a tangent there. Sorry.
No, no, but I think it's a really good point because that is what happens, isn't it? You can have a friendship group, six, eight, 10 people, whatever,
Mm,
and it, on a superficial level, it seems like you're really well connected and you're kind of socializing a lot and so on. But actually, is there much depth there? Do
mm,
you feel kind of open to share your emotions and your feelings, talk about your vulnerabilities and insecurity?
mm,
If you looked at a small group of females, for example, I think stereotypically you'd say, yeah, they'd probably be more comfortable doing that.
yeah.
Stereotypically, if you look at a male group, probably a lot less likely that it's going to happen. And actually, the opposite probably happens where rather than be vulnerable about their emotions and feelings, they're probably a lot more likely to mask them and
Yeah,
put
yeah.
on a facade of something else. So I think that's a really good point, Sam. Thanks for
Mm,
raising that. So Sam, I know there's a lot of listeners that are actually going to be quite frustrated that we're even using the term toxic masculinity
yeah.
because there's a lot of people out there, basically men, that think this term's being used to as a stick to beat men with, as a
Mm,
kind of feminism tool, and it's really unfair. And I know for a fact that there's a lot of men out there that really really hate this term being used.
mm.
So what would they say about what we've just introduced as a topic and as a term? What would the counter argument be? Do you got any feelings on that?
Mm. Yeah, I suppose just kind of sort of following on from what you said, really, I think a lot of people would see this as an insult in respect to uh, men getting sort of berated for who they are, I guess, because maybe the kind of traits that we're talking about feel like they're part of who these men are. Do you know what I mean? Or part of who you are. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? Like
So their identity is a big
yeah,
part of their
exactly.
identity.
Yeah. I suppose if you think about it in that respect, it feels like an attack on that person's identity because
Hmm.
it's these thought processes, these traits, these ideas um, feel very deeply embedded.
Mm, mm.
So using that term feels quite insulting because you're insulting who I am.
Yeah.
Makes
Hmm.
sense.
100%. And actually, we're going to get into that in a little bit more depth when we talk about where this actually come where toxic masculinity comes from, how that evolves, how that develops. Another thing that I think's worth mentioning is that the term itself kind of makes it sound like any masculinity is toxic, which
Oh, yeah.
is not the case, right? It's definitely not what we're saying, or I don't think what anyone is saying when they talk about this term.
No, absolutely not. No, there's loads of positive masculine traits, isn't there? You know, this I can understand why this it feels like that
Mm,
because you're using the term, aren't you?
mm,
It's a negative term, so you're linking a negative term with uh,
yeah.
a description, a trait.
And, and on that point, you pretty much never hear anyone say, "Oh, that's an example of positive masculinity.
No,
Well done."
very rare,
You know.
very rare.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So actually, I wonder if anything comes to your mind when you mention if there are any kind of positive masculine
Yeah.
traits.
Absolutely. I'm just going to get my because I put a post up on my Instagram thing about it, didn't I?
Okay. I did.
Yeah. So I put some examples of what positive masculinity could look like on
Brilliant,
the
brilliant.
post. Um,
Hmm.
Openly experiencing a wide range of emotions, interdependence, which is I'm not sure if
We'll
many
touch on that
people
in a minute.
understand
Yeah.
what that means because I wasn't quite sure either. Vulnerability, cooperation, kindness, and softness.
Hmm.
So, and I understand that some of these things will go against some of the traits of toxic masculinity, won't they? Because if you think about
Hmm.
softness,
Hmm.
we're talking about some of the characteristics being homophobia, for example.
Hmm. Hmm.
Some people may link softness um, to weakness.
Hmm.
Some people may link softness to um, being gay, I guess. You know, I think
Hmm. Hmm.
and you do hit, you know, growing up as a teenager, I don't know what it's like now, but gay was used as an insult when we were,
Yeah.
wasn't it? You know, and
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
was, you know, maybe part of our experiences of being toxically masculine, you know, if you know someone's a bit I don't know, uh if there was a guy at school that was more feminine than some other guys,
Hmm. Hmm.
he might have been called gay. He might not have been gay. He might have just been more
Yeah. Yeah.
feminine, you know?
Yeah.
So
Maybe in touch with that feminine energy.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
which is fine. You know, it's
It's quite healthy. It's quite healthy, isn't it, really?
absolutely is. So it's quite a complicated subject, really, isn't it? It's not
It, it, it's a
straightforward. The
really
more we
complicated.
talk, the more there's sort
Yeah.
of it's you know what I mean?
Well,
It kind of
well,
gets
just for the listeners' benefit, normally we don't talk before the session, before the
no,
podcast. We don't do any preparation. It's very much off the
jump
cuff. But with
straight in
this one,
normally.
literally, we did about 2 or 3 weeks research into the topic
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
is very sensitive and it's a very difficult topic to break down. But
yeah,
with that in mind, Sam, just moving on slightly. So,
yeah, yeah, sure.
in terms of counter arguments, just to kind of sum up that part, essentially, what people who would disagree with the term being used would
Mm,
say is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the term toxic masculinity. Um, it can be harmful to men in general. Would be a counter argument in that
mhm.
they're kind of almost shaming masculinity.
Yes.
It's a massive generalization to
Mm,
say kind of, and it's very much labeling like a group of people and like stereotyping,
mm.
which can be quite harmful in itself. And you wouldn't do that in regards to race or
No.
disability or gender. Well, this is exactly what it is, gender, isn't it?
Mm,
So um, also, you know, there are plenty of females that have toxic traits, right? Plenty of females,
yeah.
but there's not really a term being thrown around like toxic
Toxic
femininity, right?
femininity. No, you don't
Um,
hear it.
and and just for anyone that's not identifying as either a man or a woman, I'm sure there's plenty of that group of people that also have some toxic traits as well.
Yeah.
But again, you don't hear toxic transgenderinity or anything like that.
I know.
So,
I
not, I think I literally just made up a word
just
there.
made
But
that
anyway,
up.
I haven't researched that. Anyway, um, so um, a few good points there. And I think that it's definitely worth touching on that counter argument.
Mm.
Um, so before we go on, I think it'd be useful to throw in a couple of examples of toxic masculinity, just so the listeners kind of know exactly what we're talking about when we're using this term. So, do you have anything that comes to mind?
Um, just trying to think, Asa.
Shall I use my one while you think?
Yeah, if you, because I know you actually have a
Yeah,
example, don't you, to mind. So
sure.
you go ahead and I'll have a little think.
Sure, let's just use that one because actually it's
Okay.
it's it's fine. Like we don't need loads. Like it covers it, doesn't
Sorry,
it? So
my brain's not firing on full cylinders today.
that's fine, Sam. It's okay to not be okay, right?
Thank
There's a
you.
song about
Thank you.
it. Was that Taylor Swift?
I don't
I
know. Is that what
I don't
one
know.
of her lyrics?
I don't know. Yeah, it's okay to not be okay, I think.
It's a good one.
Um yeah, I mean yeah. Anyway, so the point is, right, so an example of toxic masculinity. Last night, I did say I was up slightly past my usual bedtime. The reason for that is that there was a boxing match on, the Tyson Fury Alexander Usyk fight.
Mm.
I watched the fight, and whilst I was watching it, or towards the end of the fight, I was in a bar, and a fight kicked off like right next to me. Glasses were thrown. Someone had a cut head, so on, so on. And the swearing came out and the pushing and shoving and so on. Not from me, obviously,
Mhm.
but from the people that were fighting. So I removed myself from the situation and so on. But I thought, isn't that a great example of toxic masculinity right there in a nutshell?
Yeah.
Um, and you know, so in there you've got kind of two or more guys ultimately trying to demonstrate just how masculine they can be through a fight, right?
Yeah.
Other examples you see quite a lot of, I think, are things like in the gym, you might see a lot of kind of people trying to prove just how masculine they are, whether it be in what they're doing in the gym or what they're wearing in the gym. Nothing against those things, absolutely fine, but it's just a demonstration of masculinity.
Mm.
And another example I would say is probably see it quite a lot in driving, actually. See it quite a lot in driving where um, people kind of really want to demonstrate how tough they are and masculine they are by the way they drive aggressively and so on. Again, I'm sure females and maybe transgender people do that as well, but it's just some examples of stereotypical kind of toxic
Yeah.
masculinity. So the question for me
Mm.
is, how does this happen? Because I don't think we were born wanting to throw glasses at each other's head. I don't think we were born wanting to push each other around, beat each other up, and
No.
so on and so on. So how do we get to that point? And obviously alcohol plays a part, but you see it all the time, don't you? So how do people become inverted commas toxically masculine?
Mhm. Yeah. I suppose a kind of obvious answer would be how what you've experienced as a child growing up. I think the environment that you grow up in has a big part to play, doesn't it, on how you operate as an adult. So
Mhm.
without sort of you know having the insight of working through this stuff in therapy, for example, uh,
Mhm.
I think a lot of the time people grow up and these kind of ideas and these attitudes and traits and things like that are just normal. This normalized. This is how
Mhm.
my dad treated my mum. This is how my dad was acted in the pub. This is how I
Mhm.
should act. Or do you see what I mean? I think it's kind of it's normalized growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and just for the listeners, you know, uh, just for the listeners, you're not talking about your mum, your dad. You're talking about
No, no, no.
just in general
Yeah,
parenting.
just
Yeah,
in general, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
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 So I think two things that you're touching on there are social circle, um, surrounding community, which can be very different from place to place. I think if you took a social community from the south where we're from compared to maybe say the north, for
Sure.
example, might
Yeah,
be
yeah,
might be different.
absolutely.
Yeah, social circles, absolutely. Peer groups,
Mm,
in schools and things like that, and that experience, and then like say parenting and role
mm,
models. I think that's a really good some really good examples. Also, I think there's the media, right, and kind of societal expectations.
yeah, films, books, films like Football Factory, for example.
Hmm.
That's a good,
Yeah, and
that is a film of people that are toxically masculine, isn't it, basically?
yeah, it's like a demonstration of masculinity, isn't it?
Yeah.
All the way through,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that comes with violence, that comes with
Yeah.
using drugs, using alcohol, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Domestic
okay,
violence.
sure.
The sort of extreme end of this. Um, yeah.
So ultimately, what we're talking about is family dynamics, peer group influences,
Mhm.
society, the community around us, media, and so on. So all these different factors come together to demonstrate what a man should be, right?
Yeah.
What it means to be a man. It means you're tough, you're not vulnerable, you're
Mhm.
not sensitive, you're potentially aggressive,
Mhm.
um, you're physically imposing,
Yeah.
and you're a dominant kind of figure. So that's
Yeah.
ultimately what young men are being kind of socialized into believing they should be and they
Yeah.
have to be. Is that
Mm.
right?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, there's like
Okay.
a sorry, go on.
No, and then I just to remember about the counter argument as well. I
Mm.
guess that would be I guess there's some people listening to this term toxic masculinity and have heard this term and think I, I don't want to be toxically masculine,
Mm.
so I need to be the other way. So I need to be really open about my feelings and really vulnerable and really
Yeah.
sensitive and maybe lead into more feminine energy. So I think it kind of swings, it
Mm.
swings both ways a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's very difficult, isn't it? I think, um, finding the right balance for yourself is
Hmm.
quite an individual um process, isn't it? I think it requires quite a lot of um as if kind of growing up isn't hard enough, is it? Finding out your identity and who you are. We're asking people to really kind of look at themselves, and it's really difficult stuff, actually, isn't it? As we're talking, I'm thinking, we're asking people not to have these traits and not act like this and all that. Not We're not asking them directly to do that, but you know, I suppose the term toxic masculinity is a negative term, isn't it? So, uh, but
Yeah,
it's not
I think
easy. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's not easy.
it's really hard to kind of develop an identity and grow up at any period of
Yeah.
of time, but right now especially because on the one hand there's like views are very extreme now, aren't they? So you're either one thing or the other, right? You
Mm,
can't be in the middle, and so people going through school and college and university now they have a bit of a choice really. They either follow that very defined view of what masculine is,
mm,
what certain people might call, I don't know, the Chad maybe, which we're going to get onto when
mm,
we talk about incels on our next podcast. Or they kind of go the other way and they that they really avoid these kind of masculine traits. So it's really interesting. It's really complicated.
it really
Um,
is.
but if I'm a listener listening to this, I'm thinking, yeah, all right. So what? Who cares? Why does any of this matter? What's the problem? Why is this a problem? Why do we need to dedicate 45 minutes of our Sunday morning to talk about this? Like, who cares?
Mm. Well, I mean, it's it's an interesting question, isn't it? I suppose I've got a couple of things that came to my mind straight away with that
Hmm.
question. The first thing is um, what happened last night that you witnessed.
Hmm.
You know, do we want people getting glasses smashed in their face?
Mm.
The second thing that came to my mind was what I mentioned earlier about domestic abuse and domestic violence. You know, these are both two quite extreme um, behaviors, um, experiences, whatever you want to call it. Um, but they're things that are very real. They're things that happen a lot every single day, you know,
Mm.
and
Mm.
I think that toxic masculinity, what we're talking about, negative masculinity, if you like, um,
Mm.
leads to these things, leads to violence, leads
Mm.
to you know, really unhelpful, negative views on
Mm.
things.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And also, I think that actually, in some cases, it leads to what we are talking about on the next pod, which is about the kind of incel culture. For those
Mm,
of you that don't know, incel relates to involuntarily celibate people,
mm,
generally men, but also females. And so what tends to or what seems to be happening in society is, like we talked about before, this kind of quite big divide between people that are either one way or the other.
mm,
And that in itself can be quite toxic, because ultimately, I think as a therapist, and probably for you as well, my aim is for people to be okay with themselves, not need to put on a mask, not need to be someone they're not feel any societal pressure to perform a certain way or talk a certain way or
mm.
act a certain way, but instead
Just
just to
being
be
themselves.
themselves,
Yeah.
and like we said earlier, just to be okay, whether just to be okay, right?
Mm, mm,
Have an overarching sense of okayness, right?
yeah.
That's my aim. And the things we're talking about today are, essentially moving away from that, because, you know, you're not really being your authentic self if
No.
you're so heavily influenced by the media, by role
Mm,
models, by peer groups, and so on. And actually, just on the point of role models, we kind of missed it, but I think it's a massively important point when it comes to these masculine traits. I think you touched on it quite a bit, but the role that role models play in a young boy or man's development is so important. And I know there's a lot of people out there who haven't had a positive male role model in their life.
mm,
Um, and the lack of that does lead to, or can lead to, some really negative patterns of behavior around the topics that we introduced at the top, at the start of the show, around misogyny,
mm,
homophobia,
mm.
oppressing emotions, and being angry, and potentially violent. So for me, that's the reason why this matters, right? Because we those things aren't positive, and we don't want to
So,
to have those things happening, because ultimately they're not good for anyone. Fair
no,
enough?
absolutely. And we don't want people to be hurt, do we? Ultimately, I think that's what we're talking about. We don't want you know,
Mm,
we don't want people to be in pain. We don't want violence, or bad feeling.
mm,
We don't want people kind of um, pushing emotions down so it makes them ill. You know what I mean? It's just,
mm.
but at the same time, it what we're talking about is really difficult,
Yeah.
and I think we spoke, early on. We in this podcast, we're not trying to insult anyone, are we? We're just trying to help people
Mm,
identify things that might not be very helpful.
mm. Well, a couple of things you mentioned there. So you said it's really hard, and I think that part of the reason why it's really hard is because, coming back to that divide, you know, people want to be socially accepted, don't they? They want to be approved of by their friends and their, the peers and so on. And so it's very difficult if everyone's going in one direction towards, say, toxically masculine traits, to
Mm.
then go, oh yeah, I see that, but actually I think that's I don't, I'm not really on board with that stuff, so I'm gonna just
Quite
not
difficult.
be aggressive and not be misogynistic. It's really difficult to do that and still be socially approved if that's the way that your social circle is going.
Yeah.
The other thing he said is that, it's damaging. It can be damaging both to the individual who's oppressing the emotions and that kind of thing, but also if people are being misogynistic, being what was the term we used earlier around sexually? Can't remember the exact term, but basically, notches on the bedpost kind of
Yes. Yeah.
mentality.
Yeah. Sure.
It That is very damaging to people,
Mm.
and and has consequences, right? So the reason why this is so important is because of all of these different things. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. If I'm a parent, or if well, you are a parent, if I'm a person who has these masculine traits, these toxic masculine traits,
Mm.
if I'm a partner of someone with these traits, um, or if I'm a colleague of someone with these traits, and I'm experiencing these negative impacts, what should I do? Where do I go? What's the solution?
Mm. I mean, again, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Because initially, when you said that, when you asked that, my initial response was to talk to that person about it. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't, you know, it depends, doesn't it? It depends how deeply that person is into these kind of ideas and thought processes and feelings. They may respond very defensively, like we're talking about. So it could, it could be unhelpful to do that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I always talk to people about the first step of kind of recovery, or the first step of helping yourself is by recognizing what's going on, you know, and kind of saying stuff out loud,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
So, so, so awareness, yeah.
yeah, awareness. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, and if you're a parent or a partner, um, maybe speaking to someone in your support network, I guess, rather than challenging the person. To, we've got to be careful here, haven't we? Because we don't want to necessarily challenge. It could be dangerous to challenge, couldn't it? I guess.
Well, I think the main danger with challenging someone with these traits, if you're a parent, for example, is that actually it goes the other way, right?
Yeah,
And
you push
and
them
the person
further.
rebels and then goes further down the negative path.
Mm,
Um, so I think that's a good point. Um, just a couple of things. So I think when you mentioned awareness, right? So like a lot of people come to therapy and they're like, oh, I'm developing an awareness, and that's great. But the reason that's great is that awareness of unwanted actions, behaviors, patterns, and whatever gives you the ability and the power to then make a change, to take action and interrupt that pattern or do something a little bit different. So just a couple of points for anyone that's listening that does want to try to kind of tackle this problem, if it is a problem for them, is around educating the person. So for example, if it's a problem in the workforce, there's kind of workshops that can be delivered and things like that. um Encourage it, or if you're a parent, you can encourage emotional expression and people to share their feelings and their emotions, like just like we did at the start of the show today. How are you? How often are we asked how are we, and we go, yeah, fine,
mm,
when
mm.
really that's not the case.
Automatic response. Yeah.
Exactly. So actually being encouraging the space to be open about your feelings and emotions.
Mm.
um modeling positive masculine traits and
Yes.
modeling positive behavior, whether it's as a parent, a dad, something like that,
Mm.
or a friend even, or a mentor or a peer. I think support systems are massively important as well, support network. And then also I think in schools and colleges they can do a lot to educate people as well. Um, and also challenging stereotypes is a big one too.
Yeah. I think that what you said about mirroring is really important. Mirroring positive masculinity traits, which is what myself and you would do in therapy. That would probably be a big part of how we would work with this type of stuff, isn't it? By kind of, modeling a different way.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And having positive role models in the family,
Yeah.
having positive role models, in the media.
Excuse me.
Um, Bless you. And having, yeah, having positive as many positive examples of men that, you know, are able to show vulnerability and insecurity and talk about emotions, I think is really healthy. I think that if we can move towards that as a society, then it's going to be a more positive place for everybody to just be really transparent about their feelings. Just to wrap up, because we do need to wrap up, unfortunately. I had quite an interesting discussion with someone recently where they were saying that their role model was really quite kind of not masculine, let's say. I wouldn't say feminine, but just not particularly masculine.
Mm.
And they said as a result of that, they are really masculine now. They really have a drive to be more masculine and to demonstrate their masculinity through their body size and shape, through their tone of voice, through the language used, behavior. Whereas my experience of my male role model was quite masculine, and actually, I have a slightly different way of trying to carry myself in that I kind of try to move away from those typical, masculine, kind of toxic masculinity traits. So it's just interesting, isn't it, that the role model you have can actually sometimes it can have a potentially negative effect or
Yeah,
you know
or opposite. Yeah, or
the
opposite.
opposite
Yeah,
way. Yeah,
absolutely.
because because that person that I was talking to, they were saying, well, actually, they wanted a more masculine example, and they were disappointed that they didn't get it. So then they moved towards that. It's just quite
Really
interesting thing to
interesting.
share there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
anyway,
thank you for taking the lead today, Asa. I know that I haven't been on kind of full cylinders, but it's really interesting and really good to chat to you today.
Sam, Sam, you've been fantastic as always. Just demonstrating your commitment to the cause. And just for anyone who's wondering, the cause is to create a increased awareness around mental health issues and a forum for people to talk through things. If there's anyone out there who would like us to cover a specific topic, like I say, next week we're covering incels, but if there are any topics, feel free to message us in the chat or in the comments,
Yeah,
anything like that. If you're listening on Spotify, feel free to give us a 5-star rating. More than happy to accept all of those. And otherwise, lovely to connect with you and see you next time.
yeah. Thanks, Asa. See you next
All right,
time.
Sam. Great stuff. Take care. Bye bye.
Yes, bye. Bye.